At? Mr. Adam was opening the morning's letters in the outer office. "What is his name, Mr. Slington?" I asked. "What is the name, Mr. Slington?" I asked. "Beckwith." I looked out at the door and requested Mr. Adams, if there were a proposal in that name, to bring it in. He had already laid it out of his hand on the counter. It was easily selected from the rest, and he gave it to me. Alfred Beckwith. Proposal to effect a policy with us for £2,000, dated yesterday. From Middle Temple, I see, Mr. Slington. Yes, he lives on the same staircase with me. His door is opposite. I never thought he would make me his reference, though. It seems natural enough that he would. It seems natural enough that he should. Quite so, Mr. Sampson. But I never thought of it. Let me see. He took the printed paper from his pocket. How am I to answer all these questions? According to the truth, of course, said I. Oh, of course, he answered, looking up from the paper with a smile. I meant there were so many. But you do right to be particular. It stands to reason that you must be particular. Will you allow me to use your pen and ink? Certainly. And your desk? Certainly. He had been hovering about between his hat and his umbrella for a place to write. He now sat down in my chair at my blotting paper and inkstand, with a long walk up his head in an accurate perspective before me, as I stood with my back to the fire. Before answering each question, he ran it over aloud and discussed it. How long had he known Mr. Alfred Beckwith? That he had to calculate by years upon his fingers. What were his habits? No difficulty about them. Temperate in the last degree, and took a little too much exercise, if any. All the answers were satisfactory. When he had written them all, he looked them over, and finally signed them in a very pretty hand. He supposed he had now done with the business. I told him he was not likely to be troubled any further. Should he leave the papers there? If he pleased. Much obliged. Good morning. I had had one other visitor before him, not at the office, but at my own home. That visitor had come to my bedside when it was not yet daylight, and had been seen by no one else but my faithful confidential servant. A second reference paper, for we required always two, was sent down into Norfolk, and was duly received back by post. This, likewise, was satisfactorily answered in every respect. Our forms were all complied with. We accepted the proposal, and the premium for 1 year was paid. For 6 or 7 months I saw no more of Mr. Slington. He called once at my house when I was not at home, and he once asked me to dine with him in the Temple, but I was engaged. His friend's assurance was effected in March. Late in September or early in October, I was down at Scarborough for a breath of sea air, where I met him on the beach. It was a hot evening. He came toward me with his hat in his hand, and there was a walk I felt so strongly disinclined to take in perfect order again, exactly in front of the bridge of my nose. He was not alone, but had a young lady on his arm. She was dressed in mourning, and I looked at her with great interest. She had the appearance of being extremely delicate, and her face was remarkably pale and melancholy, but she was very pretty. He introduced her as his niece, Miss Nina. "Are you strolling, Mr. Sampson? Is it possible you can be idle?" It was possible, and I was strolling. "Shall we stroll together?" "With pleasure." The young lady walked between us, and we walked on the cool sea sand in the direction of Philly. "There have been wheels here," said Mr. Slington, "and now I look again the wheels of a hand-carriage. Margaret, my love, your shadow without doubt." "Miss Nina's shadow?" I repeated, looking down on the sand. "Not that one," Mr. Slington returned, laughing. "Margaret, my dear, tell Mr. Sampson." "Indeed," said the young lady, turning to me, There is nothing to tell, except that I constantly see the same invalid old gentleman at all times, wherever I go. I have mentioned it to my uncle, and he calls the gentleman my shadow." "Does he live in Scarborough?" I asked. "He is staying here." "Do you live in Scarborough?" "No, I am staying here. My uncle has placed me with a family here for my health." "And your shadow?" said I, smiling. "My shadow," she answered, smiling too, "is, like myself, not very robust, I fear, for I lose my shadow sometimes, as my shadow loses me at other times. We both seem liable to confinement to the house. I have not seen my shadow for days and days, but it does oddly happen occasionally that wherever I go for many days together, this gentleman goes. We have come together on the most unfrequented nooks on this shore." "Is this he?" said I, pointing before us. The wheels had swept down the water's edge, and describing a great loop on the sand in turning, bringing the hoop back towards us, and spinning it out as it came, was a hand carriage drawn by a man. "Yes," said Miss Nina, "this really is my shadow, uncle." As the carriage approached us, and we approached the carriage, I saw within it an old man, whose head was sunk on his breast, and who was enveloped in a variety of wrappers. He was drawn by a very quiet but very keen-looking man, with iron-grey hair, and who was slightly lame. They had passed us when the carriage stopped, and the old gentleman within, putting out his arm, called to me by my name. I went back, and was absent from Mr. Slinkton and his niece for about 5 minutes. When I rejoined them, Mr. Slinkton was the first to speak. "Indeed," he said to me in a raised voice before I came up with him, "it is well you have not been longer, or my niece might have died of curiosity to know who her shadow is, Mr. Sampson." "An old East India director," said I, "an intimate friend of our friends, at whose house I first had the pleasure of meeting you. A certain Major Banks. You have heard of him?" "Never." "Very rich, Miss Nina, but very old and very crippled. An amiable man, sensible, much interested in you. He has just been expatiating on the affection that he has observed to exist between you and your uncle." Mr. Slinkton was holding his hat again, and he passed his hand up the straight walk, as he himself went up it serenely after me. "Mr. Sampson," he said, tenderly pressing his niece's arm in his, "our affection was always a strong one, for we have had but few near ties. We have still fewer now. We have associations to bring us together that are not of this world, Margaret." "Dear uncle," murmured the young lady, and turned her face aside to hide her tears. "My niece and I had such remembrances and regrets in common, Mr. Sampson," he feelingly pursued, "that it would be strange indeed if the relations between us were cold or indifferent. If I remember a conversation we have had together, you will understand the reference I make. Cheer up, dear Margaret. Don't droop, don't droop. My Margaret, I cannot bear to see you droop." The poor young lady was very much affected, but controlled herself. His feelings, too, were very acute. In a word, he found himself under such a great need of a restorative, that he presently went away to take a bath of sea-water, leaving the young lady and me sitting by a point of rock, and probably presuming, but that you will say was a pardonable indulgence in her luxury, that she would praise him with all her heart. She did, poor thing. With all her confiding heart she praised him to me, for his care of her dead sister, and for his untiring devotion in her last illness. The sister had wasted away very slowly, and wild and terrible fantasies had come over her toward the end, but he had never been impatient with her, or at a loss, had always been gentle, watchful, and self-possessed. The sister had known him as she had known him to the best of men, the kindest of men, and yet a man of such admirable strength of character, as to be a very tower for the support of their weak natures.